All right, welcome to Public Discourse's new deep dive series. Thank you for joining us. I'm here today with Dr. Dixie Lane. Dixie, thank you so much for joining us today. We are here to discuss your recent Public Discourse article on free-range parenting. So first of all, can you just tell our viewers a little bit about yourself and a little bit about the article?
Sure, and thank you.
Yeah.
I'm really delighted to be talking with you today, Serena. I'm so grateful for all your work at Public Discourse. So I am a mother of four children. I live in Virginia, and I'm an American historian and writer, editor, sort of involved in all things communication and language. And the article that we're discussing today, Free Range Kids and the Parental Compass, is one that comes out of many, many years of thought and practical personal experience as a parent. And I really want to address in our wider culture this question of whether children are really getting the kind of formation in free play and independence and problem solving and things like that that I think really is necessary for a strong, vibrant society of adults.
Hmm. Yeah, that's really beautiful. How old are your children?
So I have four, as I said. So
Yeah.
my oldest is about to turn 13. She turns 13
Okay.
this summer. And then I have a 10-year-old, an almost 7-year-old, and a 4-year-old.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, we'll put the link to Dixie's article in the show notes. So if you haven't seen it yet, feel free to pause it and go read it and come back. But it opens with a little vignette of a story about your son. So I was wondering, I noticed you didn't say how old he was, but going off on an adventure by himself on a mission.
Yeah,
Um,
he
is
was
he
9 then,
okay?
I think, and he was with his older sister. I like to
Yeah.
send little packs when I can.
Yes.
Yeah, but that was a
Yeah.
really funny funny experience because as I relate in the article, in our family, we're a little bit sort of tech hesitant as far as
Uh-huh.
the children go. And so we don't use MP3 players or smartphones for music for them. They each
Mm.
have a CD player in their rooms and they can listen to audiobooks or music that way. But my
Mm-hmm.
son, my 9-year-old didn't have one. And he just decided after waiting and waiting for me to take him to get one that he was going to go get one.
Mm-hmm.
And what ended up happening is he, had this idea. He'd walk to the flea market, his sister would go with him, and he'd look. And I said, "Well, how are you going to know if it's going to work?" And he said, "Well, I'll bring a CD and I won't buy it
Mm-hmm.
unless I can test it." And then he comes walking back, and there's this big white blob. It's almost bigger than him.
Uh-huh.
And when he arrived at home, I realized he had bought a karaoke machine because it had a
Yeah.
CD deck. And
Uh-huh.
it also had a microphone and an enormous speaker. So
Yeah.
these are the wages of giving your children independence.
Sometimes it works out differently than you
Yeah, but it
expected.
was it was great.
Yeah.
It was good problem solving. Why
Yes.
not? Why not buy that one?
Yeah. That's interesting that he was around 9. So I have three girls. And so my oldest is 8.
Hmm.
And then I have a 7-year-old and almost 2-year-old. So
Hmm.
my 8-year-old I feel like is both the 7 and the 8-year-old are starting to, want more independence. But
Hmm.
especially, yeah, that really the goal setting, the thinking through, I've given her some ways that she can earn money. So she saves up for things now and planning out. Um, so I like that idea also that it was a self-chosen adventure. It reminds me, you talk a little bit farther on in the article about The Anxious Generation, the new book by Jonathan Haidt, which is generating a ton of conversation. And I think rightly pointing a spotlight on the effects on mental health of sort of our unquestioning acceptance of tech, especially smartphones.
Hmm.
Um, but I know that his Let Grow, that organization that he and Lenore Scazy and it's Skenazy, I'm not going to say
Hmm.
her name right, but
I think that's how you say it. I'm not
is it?
sure.
Okay. Well, so that Let Grow, they have just like so many great resources on their website for teachers, for parents. But one of the things that I thought was really interesting was their sort of uh, it's kind of flipping exposure therapy on its head a little bit of like helping kids with anxiety face their or grow in courage, not necessarily by facing their fears in the sense of, I'm really scared of, I have one of my daughters has a lot of anxiety around bugs, right? Like, so
Yeah.
traditional exposure therapy would be like exposing them to bugs, things like this. But um, height and Skenazy, like they talk about how there's actually uh, really great success when you let kids choose a totally unrelated adventure of that involves something kind of scary, some independence going off like your kid's story. That they're doing something new, learning a new skill, facing their fears, and that translates over into other areas of their life and lessens kind of overall anxiety.
There's been
Yeah,
recently research suggesting, I mean, like peer-reviewed research suggesting
right.
that this is an effective therapy for childhood anxiety,
Mm-hmm.
clinical anxiety. And Peter
Yeah.
Gray, who I mentioned in the article too, and was one of the other founders of Let Grow,
Mm-hmm.
has written on this. He's a psychologist who studies play, especially.
Yeah.
And I think it comes down to what you really need to counteract anxiety. And many of us feel, I think most of us feel that there's a lot of anxiety just floating free in our
Yeah.
culture among adults, among children. We're talking about it a lot. We're all anxious about it. Um, but you can't fix someone's anxiety by telling them it's going to be okay. So if you have a child who's afraid of dogs, just telling them it's going to be okay, that doesn't do anything to counteract this fear they're experiencing, the dog yapping and the dog drooling and the dog
Mm-hmm.
being unpredictable or whatever it is that's bothering them. But if you can get them to start thinking of themselves as resilient people,
Mm-hmm.
you know, that's much more effective. So if they think of themselves as resilient, as they start to think that they are able to do hard things, if they,
Right.
some forms of anxiety therapy, and I'm not a psychologist, but,
Yeah.
having read about it, will try to take the approach of, well, so what would happen if the dog did attack you?
Right.
And
Worst
that the
case
point of
scenario.
that is to teach the person to say, well, actually I could probably push the dog off,
Mm.
or something like that. So with this Let Grow project, that they have at the website, the idea is you let the child choose anything, and I talk a lot about going places independently, but that's not the
Yes.
only thing that they could do. Children will bake a pie or anything that seems a little like, "Ooh, I wouldn't normally be allowed to do this." That teaches them that they can do that kind of thing, and then they have
Mm-hmm.
confidence, and they also have the ability to act instead of relying on others to act on their behalf.
Mm. Yeah, I thought it was really interesting the way that you connected free range parenting with attachment.
Mhm.
Um, because I think that the science of attachment, I don't know, maybe there's been a little bit of pushback in recent years, but I remember when I became a mom for the first time in 2016, there was so much emphasis on attachment parenting to, I think, an unhealthy degree and a degree that misunderstood and overstated the actual science that we know about attachment, right? That you have to do all of these, you have to co-sleep, you have to breastfeed till they're 3, you have to, like there's a very rigid set of behaviors that new moms are being told they had to do, or else they were going to give their child issues for the rest of their life, right? Which I think can be very, very anxiety producing and really hard for a new mom. But it's really interesting because that's not really true to what we do know about the science of attachment, right? That it is something really core and really important, but it's, I don't know, more durable than, uh, it's not this sort of, um, you have to do all of these things. I think I've heard this, that you need to be about 80% of the time, like you're regularly trying to meet the kid's needs, you're trying to repair when there's conflict, things like this. But I think it's really interesting the connection that you drew between having a secure attachment to a parent and then sort of the freedom that gives rise to. Can you like talk a little bit more about that or explain that connection a little more?
Sure, and
Uh,
Serena, I completely understand where you're coming from about that burden of the vehemence of,
yeah.
and not just attachment, but any particular parenting style. It's
Hmm.
it plays on our fears that we have to perfectly follow this thing or we'll ruin our children. And the worst part about it is that sometimes it doesn't work.
Mm.
And then you feel, I've done everything the book told me to do, and it is not working with my child. Is it something wrong with me? Is it something wrong with my child? It
Mm.
creates such a burden for young parents. And one of the things I love about Gordon Neufeld's work on attachment, and I mentioned his book along with Gabor Mate in the article, is that he speaks not just of attachment, but of what he calls orientation. So a child can orient him or herself towards different people in terms of whose opinion they care about the most, who they
Mm.
listen to the most, who they want to be closest to. And to me, that's kind of like the orientation on a compass. So the idea is if your child is oriented towards you because of secure attachment,
Mhm.
then when that child walks away, he's still carrying that compass.
Mm.
But if your child is oriented towards his peers primarily, and every child needs peers, peer interaction is a good thing,
Mhm.
right? But if the primary orientation is toward the peer, then
Yeah.
all of the protective aspects of the attachment to the parent aren't as strongly in play. So I
Mm.
think in some ways we have a very peer-oriented culture for children. You know,
Yeah.
children are in schools, they are not in mixed age schools mostly, so
Mhm.
they're oriented towards a very narrow slice of their peers as well. And we also, as Timothy Carney mentioned in his
Mhm.
recent book, Family Unfriendly, you know, we schedule children in scheduled adult-led activities
Yes.
so that really we're not sort of having as much casual interaction and working in the home interaction and that kind of thing that we might have in previous generations. And
Mhm.
so we really set up children to be oriented towards the people they're with all the time, who are there,
Uh-huh.
this narrow peers. Um, that is okay if the parent orientation is stronger. You know, you want kids to like their classmates and get along with
Right.
them. But Neufeld has some examples from his own family about starting to see, for example, his teenage daughter get less and less willing to talk to him,
Mm.
less and less willing to hug, you know, more and more disdainful. And he realized she was sort of not so much healthily differentiating herself
Right.
from him, but
Mm.
she was orienting towards the peer culture, which was disdainful of parents.
Mm.
And that kind of orientation is changeable. So you can do things to restore that orientation if it starts to slip. And in terms of the free ranging, what I have found, at least with my own children, is that um, you know, going forth into the world with that strong compass toward our family is really protective of them. It helps them to use the formation and the advice and things like that they've gotten at home to make good choices outside of the home so that
Mhm.
they're not going along with whatever they encounter.
Mhm.
So, you know, that's sort of the idea, is that when you build that attachment at the beginning, you can get a longer and longer tether. You don't keep that
Right.
same physical proximity and that same even authority. You know, eventually these children become adults. You
Mhm.
can't maintain that authority, but you can maintain the attachment and you can maintain an orientation towards things that are good rather than an orientation towards things that are more fickle or less trustworthy.
Yeah. That's really fascinating. I really like how what you're saying really centers the relationship between the unique parent and their child.
Mhm.
And it makes me think of, you use the phrase the parental compass,
Mhm.
where which feels very different to me than the sort of trying to parent and produce a perfect child based on an expert's, that sort of
Yeah.
following certain rules. Um, I really love reading parenting books, learning about all of this
Yeah.
stuff. But I do think that it can be dangerous if you don't sort of take what you learn there and integrate it into uh, a sort of self-confident identity as a parent in relationship to your particular child, which can be really, really hard to do. But I think it is ultimately really empowering. Um, I
Yeah.
think,
Yeah.
yeah,
But so I was going to say we have to
yeah,
change how we parent too over time. And I
uh-huh.
think that's something, I'm by no means an experienced parent as compared to
More so
a
than I
10
am.
years
Yeah,
older than me, but I
yeah,
have a child entering adolescence, so that's
hmm
who I am, and I still have young ones at home. And you know, when they're little, there's so much you have to do for them. You have to not only meet their needs, but you have to protect them in a way that is very, I mean, anyone who's had an 18-month-old knows, you can't free range an 18 month
right.
old.
No,
They will swing from the rafters or,
yes,
climb in the dishwasher or whatever.
uh-huh,
But what you are doing at that age is you are allowing just a little bit, a little
uh-huh.
bit. They're going a few feet away from mama and then they're coming back in and checking in.
Yeah, it's that dance,
But
right? Yeah.
but as they get older, I think sometimes it's hard for us as parents to change our own behavior because that was effective at keeping them safe when they were
hmm
babies. But older children have to start to learn how to keep themselves safe. And you mentioned Jonathan Haidt in his book, The
Yeah,
Anxious Generation, and he's not the only one who mentions this, but even in the past 10 years, I remember reading several years ago a study about risky play. So this
yeah.
particular one was about playgrounds.
hmm
Playgrounds that parents look at them, and they go, oh no, 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 no.
Uh-huh.
That is time. That is too steep. There's a hole there on the third floor,
hmm
We all know that feeling. But anyway, this study found, and it's been confirmed by some other research, that children were safer on those playgrounds unsupervised than they were
mm
supervised. There were fewer injuries and accidents. So when a child expects their mother or father to be entirely in control of their safety, whether
hmm
physical or moral or emotional, that child is completely released from that mental load.
mm
So the child expects the parent to come run up and say, don't go down that slide. But when the child is unsupervised, the child goes up to the slide and has to ask himself, should I go down this slide?
Uh-huh.
If I do, what do I need to do? Like, what do I do if it goes too fast? How am I going to stop myself?
Mm-hmm.
So if we take away from children the opportunity to ask that kind of question, they can easily get to 21 and they're legally adults and they don't have that experience of risk assessment.
Yes. Yeah, and that's interesting because I think of that experience of risky play, both of leading towards sort of psychological self-mastery and confidence, but also a kind of integration with the body, right? You're like actually putting yourself out there in physical space and experiencing kind of the thrill of it, but also maybe the injury of it, all of these sort of like, I don't know, becoming more at home in your body, uh,
Mhm.
which is very much the opposite of uh, kind of our childhood spent on screens, right?
Right,
Or as you're describing, the like parentally mediated interaction with the world where like everything is cushioned,
right.
like you're not actually really risking anything or you're not actually really gaining anything, right?
And in a
Um,
way, when you reach a certain age, and I mean, that's a judgment
yeah.
of the parent,
Mhm.
hopefully in conversation with the child, but you need to start giving your child opportunity to encounter situations that are not terrifically dangerous, but
Right,
have a
right.
little bit of risk, and then see what the child does, and then have the child have the opportunity to come ask you about it. So with something like reading, even, when my children who are very young, I do, if there's a book that I think is teaching something that's strongly against our family's values, I will not
hmm
allow the child to read that book. But with my oldest child, she is at a point in her maturity and in her knowledge of the ways of the world that she is reading, um, books that are for adults, and she
hmm
will come to me if she has a question, or we can talk about these things so that she learns that the fact that a book mentions some behavior or something violent or something
hmm
doesn't mean that we can't engage with it or learn from it or think about it, but here's how we do it. And then you do that kind of modeling.
Right.
So instead of protecting the child completely, you're modeling how do we engage? How do we engage with
Mhm.
risks? And with the body, like you were talking about, things like jumping from heights. First of all, we know children need to do it for their bones, for their
Uh-huh.
bones
Right.
to be
Yeah.
strong. They need that impact. That's why kids love trampolines partly, right? And also the
Uh-huh.
vestibular stimulation and all of
Uh,
that. But um, the question is, it do we allow them only to jump from 1 foot? Do we allow them to jump from 3 feet? Do we allow them to jump from 5 feet? Do we allow them to
mhm.
jump from 8 feet? I'm kind of like a 4 footer
Uh-huh.
personally.
Uh-huh.
Nobody wants their kid jumping from the second story. And sometimes we do see pictures of kids doing that from the
Uh-huh.
past, but I think our tendency is to say, don't jump
Uh-huh.
or don't climb up slides.
Right.
Whereas if you sit back for a second, you go, well, that's kind of a good physical activity. Maybe
Right.
we say, don't climb up slides where you can't see if anyone's coming down.
Uh-huh.
So that's the sort of little adjustment that I think in our thinking we can make to give our children slightly bigger boundaries where big problems are unlikely to happen, but they're in charge of themselves.
Yeah. I like that image of the jumping. I'm having flashbacks to my own childhood because I was raised on the farm where my mom grew up, and there's like this sloping roof that you can get out to from
Mhm.
this little deck that we have. So we spent a lot of time like hanging out on the roof, and we would jump off of it, my brothers. And that
Right.
was probably, I'm trying to think what that would be like, 6 feet, 7 feet.
Yeah.
Like I might
Yeah.
we go up there a lot with my parents, but my kids haven't yet uh discovered the fun of jumping off there. I don't know if
But it's
we're,
also it's also
yeah.
kind of like, okay, everybody's going to make their own judgment about the height or
Yeah,
whatever. But if the kid never jumps, does he learn how to fall?
right.
Right? Children need to know how to fall. They need to know how to protect their bodies. So
Yeah.
there's like this,
Yeah.
okay, bruised knees, scrapes, those things should be part of childhood. We don't want
Hmm.
anybody to break their neck. We don't want anybody to break a bone. Sometimes a kid does break a bone,
Right.
you know, and we don't want to encourage that to happen, but trying to protect children from the bumps and bruises of childhood, it means they don't learn how to use their bodies safely or they don't develop the movement that they need for their own health.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Now, I think I have a clearer sense of um, the importance and how to handle maybe the physical risk taking. I feel like I'm still trying to figure out some of the, I don't know, the social, like I'm thinking about, my older two girls, like my, my oldest one is very, very cautious. So I wouldn't worry about her going off with a stranger or, like doing something unsafe in that context. Um, but my second daughter just has such a deep trust in the goodness of the world, right? Like almost that I want to preserve. But I also know that I feel like she would follow a stranger with a puppy, and it's that like, how do you equip kids um, to be safe without overstating the dangers of stranger danger or that kind of instilling fear that's not warranted. Um I think I don't know if you have thoughts or approaches that have worked well on how you sort of teach your kids to deal with other people, unknown people.
Sure. Well, I think
Yeah.
part of that is knowing your children, and you've given this wonderful description of the attitudes of your two older children.
Uh-huh.
And it may be that your second daughter needs a little longer, or
Hmm.
perhaps before she's doing things totally independently out on her own, or perhaps you might do them together longer than you might
Uh-huh.
otherwise, so there's all sorts of things you could do, but I think some of it is, in my opinion, that when you are with them, you take that opportunity to teach them the skills they need. And that goes on for a long, long time. So my kids are country kids. We live on the edge of town in a very
Uh-huh.
rural area of Virginia. And I realized a few years ago, maybe 3 years ago, they really didn't know how to use a crosswalk or,
Oh, oh yeah.
press the buttons or anything like that. Because
Hmm.
when I was growing up, I don't even remember not knowing how to do that because I lived in an urban area, but
Uh-huh.
they don't know. So what are the things that they don't know that you need to
Mm-hmm.
prepare them with? So they need to practice that with you. Things like how to talk to clerks in stores. you know, even very young children can make their own purchases, and you just gotta keep yourself back. You just gotta keep yourself from going, "Say thank you, honey." You tell them
Uh-huh.
first, "Say
Hmm.
thank you, honey," and then afterwards, "How do you think that went?" And you're right,
Debriefing. Yeah.
so what can happen. So there are those things, and then there are things like, you know, there are some safety things that are important to know. And they're not just about how to avoid someone who's trying to harm you, but also how to get help. So, two things that I emphasized to my children before they started having unsupervised walks and things like that. One thing was, who can you go to for help? How do you identify who you can help? My
Hmm.
mother always told me, if you get lost, look for a mother, look for a woman with
Hmm.
children. Very unlikely to hurt you,
Uh-huh.
you know? Or one time my kids were out walking, and they have a dumb phone, that we have a family dumb phone that they take.
Okay. Yeah.
There are no pay phones
Right.
anymore. Like, you and I could have used pay phones, but
Right.
so, they were running late. They were supposed to call me if they were running late. They couldn't get the dumb phone to work, and they recognized, our insurance agency. They were passing
Oh.
by our life insurance agency, and they went in and they asked to use the phone. And they called me from the phone, and I thought that was super problem solving,
Hmm. Yeah.
so you can ask a shopkeeper for help,
Uh-huh.
right? And then, the the other thing is that they need to know, in terms of their orientation towards you and their attachment to you, that you are not going to be mad at them for making a mistake if they feel unsafe. So they need to know to make a big fuss if they feel uncomfortable, and
Mm.
not worry about whether they might be wrong or they might be offending someone, because you can work that out.
Hmm.
If it was somebody being nice and they just misunderstood it, fine. That's fine. You
Uh-huh.
will be on their side. You will not be angry at them for being impolite,
Right.
you know? So, those are sort of the basics, and then I just think that that sort of gradual movement towards you're not dropping them off downtown, with a
Right.
banana and say, "See you in 9 hours."
Uh-huh.
First, you go,
Yeah.
like, we have this little, we have a big post office in our town, and then there's a very small post office the next town over. And you can park right in front of the post office and see in the window. So I would take a prepaid package and give it to my 6-year-old and have her go in and hand it to the lady whom she'd seen a million times, you know?
Right.
And, I struggle to imagine what could possibly be dangerous in that.
Uh-huh.
But there's still something inside me that thinks, "Oh, my baby. My baby
Right.
is
Right.
being 6 feet away from me through a door."
Uh-huh.
And what I realized at some point is that fear is never going away. So I have to make my judgments based on other things.
Yeah. And I think for me, and I've heard other people say this too, sometimes the fear is not even so much for the actual safety of the child as what other parents are going to think of me
Right.
or other adults, right? Um, and so I like that you talked about the community piece,
Mm,
because I feel like so I maybe I guess like the opposite experience of you that I grew up in the country, but now I'm raising kids
mhm,
in a very dense suburb, like the
mhm,
first ring of the Philadelphia suburbs, and we chose this neighborhood in large part because it is super walkable, right? Like
mhm.
it's all four-way stops on every street, and it's like they can
Yeah.
walk to their school and church and all this stuff. Um, but it's like it takes time to get to know neighbors and sort of intense, I don't know, I guess conscientious community building, right? Like, because I want them to know where different people live if when I do let them start walking to school by themselves or different things like that. Because I feel like you can't really do it alone, right? It's sort of the network effect of that there are other trustworthy adults around,
Well,
you
that's
know?
that's what's hard about it, is not only is it
Yeah.
not really normal, so you may get
Right.
judged for it,
Yeah.
you may even get a call because of it.
Hmm.
But, it's also not something that's shared, so it's not like there are a bunch of people who are
Right.
used to just sort of there's not a social culture. Like, I grew up partly in France when I was a
Mm.
child, and, um, there was at that time a social culture there that adults basically would tolerate children and wouldn't pay any attention
Huh.
to children in public, but they
Yeah.
would step in if a child was doing something dangerous. That was acceptable and expected.
Uh-huh.
Whereas
Yeah.
here, we might actually be a little afraid to
Hmm.
step in if we thought a child was doing something dangerous. So in terms of that community building, once you have established a little bit of a community like that,
Hmm.
you can depend on it. So it takes some work getting to know people or getting to know neighbors. I found that, I actually had an essay a few weeks ago at Front Porch Republic about hand cranked ice cream and how
Oh,
it
yeah.
can bring people together and work against
Yeah.
despair. And really, sitting out in your front
Mm.
yard with an ice cream machine,
Uh-huh.
people will come. Or you can send the kids to knock on the door and say, "Do you want some
Yeah.
ice cream? We have so much." And
Uh-huh.
building that kind of little thing tells you who on the street sees your children out playing and thinks, "That's wonderful. It's wonderful
Yes.
that those kids are out there." Because there are lots of people who support this kind of activity, and you just need to make the connection. And then the other thing is, I told that story about my kids going into the insurance agency to
Hmm.
call. So they called and I told them, "Okay, good. Well, I'll see you in 15 minutes. Thank you for calling. That was a good use of judgment." You know, they left. 2 minutes later, I got a call from the insurance agency. "Mrs. Lane, we have your number because you have an insurance policy with us. And were your children, do you realize your children were just in here?" So that kind of phone
Yeah.
call can go two ways. It can go, "It's none of your business. Why are you calling me?" It can be hostile. But I see that kind of thing as an opportunity to bring that person in to your
Uh-huh.
community. So my response instead was, "Thank you so much for calling. Don't you think they use great judgment going to a place they
Mhm.
knew was safe and asking to use the phone? I so appreciate your letting them do that. um, Please, call me anytime you have any concerns about them." And then she was able to say, "Oh yeah, that was pretty good judgment. And I've seen them before walking there." And I said, "Yes, they're very responsible. I've walked that route with them 100 times."
Mhm.
And it reassures that person and it makes that person likely to help my children if they're in
Yeah,
trouble and to
yeah.
call me
Right.
instead of calling the police.
Yes.
So people come from a place of care.
Right.
And if you can welcome that instead of being defensive, you've just got another spoke in your wheel, you know?
Yeah. And that's really beautiful, I think, for other maybe unattached adults too, to be like, it's almost a gift to be given that responsibility for other children, right? Like
Mhm.
there's a connection there that you're trusting them to be part of that kind of localized safety net of
Yeah,
people who care for the kids in the neighborhood, you know?
yeah.
Um, yeah, that's really beautiful. Uh, do you have any, we're running out of time.
Mhm.
So I'm trying to think if there are any other things I wanted to make sure to ask you about. Do you have any favorite books or resources for helping kids learn life skills or
Oh, yeah.
sort of independent, I'm starting to look into this for my 8-year-old, so it's a selfish question, but
Yeah, I mean, I mentioned a number of them in
yeah,
in the article, and I think for
yeah.
parents, Let Grow is the place to start. The Let Grow
Mhm,
website, and they have on there a Let Grow project, that really your children get to design,
mhm.
and that's very fruitful for kids. I also think just older literature, when I was a child, I grew up when I grew up partly in California and partly in Paris in France, as I mentioned.
Wow,
And
okay.
when I was in California, I was not allowed a lot of independence. And it was because our neighborhood was really not particularly safe. And I remember reading these stories of children, the boxcar children, and just
Yeah.
anybody, even Anne of Green Gables, who's walking around her community with her friends. And
Hmm.
those are the stories that give children ideas of how things work or how they
Hmm.
might experience things or what they might do, how they
Yeah.
might interact with people, scrapes they might get into. So those are
Yeah.
just wonderful things to read with them. And I think just, you know, giving the little push that they might need to do something like, if you're going through Dunkin' Donuts, you could go through the drive-through if you're lucky enough to have it drive you,
Yeah.
park, and you can
Yeah.
hand the child a $10 bill, and you can
Hmm.
say, "Go in and pick any dozen donuts you want." And
Hmm.
they may say, "I don't feel comfortable without you." And if you can test those waters and just
Yeah.
say, "You know, I really think you can do this. I really
Mm.
think I want you to try." And if they really won't, then whatever. But, they'll come back from that, "Oh, wow, I actually can."
Yeah.
It's wonderful. It's just wonderful.
Yeah. Yeah. I love that. My kids also love the Boxcar Children, and
Mhm,
like I have so many good memories of those. And it's funny because I remember reading like the Ramona books, the
mhm.
Beverly Cleary, when I was a kid, and it just sounded so magical to me. This neighborhood where the kids were just roaming around on
Yeah.
bikes and everything. But it's funny because I feel like in this neighborhood that we're in, it sort of has a little bit of that feel. Like that's more. My kids listen to it. We have Yodo players,
Mhm. Yeah,
so like it's a different approach, similar to your
right.
CD approach, but it's
Mhm.
a screen-free listening. Anyway, so they love to listen as they fall asleep to the Ramona books. And it's that I've heard it described as, I think there's a public discourse article actually talking about how Beverly Cleary has that positive world Christianity, that sort of um cohesive understanding of that community where
Mhm.
kids can have that independence and roaming around free, which is
And
just a
and
beautiful thing to try to build, you know.
one more quick idea in there
Yeah.
is looking for other families that are physically in your neighborhood that
Yes.
wanna do
Yeah.
this, because your kids' friends, they may live several neighborhoods away, and that's fine, but you may be able to find some kids who
Hmm.
either live in your neighborhood or whose parents are comfortable with you picking them up and
Hmm.
dropping them somewhere for an hour at a coffee shop. Or maybe the first time you sit in the back corner of the coffee shop. So you can
Hmm.
find allies for your children and your family as well.
Yeah. That's wonderful. Well, thank you so much. I really enjoyed talking with you.
Thank you.
Okay. Have a great day.
You too.